Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, and I'm the host of the ENC In Depth podcast. Today's In Depth recording is the second part of a two-part podcast discussion dedicated to emerging forms of Islamic civil society in Central Asia. The podcast is part of an online regional policy dialogue organized by the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs in cooperation with the European Neighbourhood Council, and it was supported by the Hollings Center for International Dialogue, during which experts from Central Asia, the EU, and the US examined the emergence of Islamic civil society within the context of different value systems, including state secularism and Western backed civil society. So, almost 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, Central Asians, in particular the younger generation, are demanding that Islam play a more central role in public and private life. But the governments of Central Asia have adopted strict secular regimes, framing certain religious activities as threats to national security by labeling them as non traditional and extremist. At the same time, forms of Islamic civil society, including Hashar, meaning mutual help, Islamic microfinance, and aid to those affected by COVID 19 are emerging, often promoted by prominent Islamic influencers via the social media. During the first part of our in depth podcast, we talked about what is Islamic civil society, how it's divided, how they operate, and how they are funded, what kind of activities, and what are the challenges they face. In today's second part of our podcast discussion, I would like to start the first question addressing to you, David, is by asking you, shall we actually distinguish civil society organizations in Islamic and non-Islamic? Is that correct?
Within the Central Asian context, there are folks who are engaging engaging civil society from an Islamic perspective, and in that sense, it makes sense. But I think that there are, because you see that it shapes the way in which people choose to engage society. But I think at another level, it complicates things because you have different organizations who get bracketed out as being religious or not religious, when that may or may not be what drives it. And I think it also oversimplifies the fact that characterizing it as Islamic, that there's great diversity within both aspects of the organizations, whether they are religious or not. Because there certainly could be folks who are engaging in secular civil society organizations who identify as being quite religious. So I think that one has to be cognizant of how we're trying to characterize it and what the implications of that are, and what the context are out of which civil society emerges historically, and how that's brought into the analysis of it.
Thank you, David. Moving on to you, Noah. How is Islamic civil society perceived in Central Asia? What is the current narrative in place, if I may ask?
Well, of course, that depends on who you ask. And even the question of whether or not there is something that is defined as Islamic civil society versus secular civil society, or sort of a Western liberal, or what we might call from a Western liberal perspective, what we think of as a normative kind of civil society. There are oftentimes where those groups within communities might define themselves in opposition to one another, even though there are many other circumstances in which, as David mentioned, they may overlap, and there are many people working within registered non-government organizations who also are people of Islamic faith, and who don't see a strong divide between these things. And then standing outside of all of this are the states in the region, who have, generally speaking, as overwhelmingly authoritarian states in the whole region, have a fairly deep suspicion of civil society activity that takes place outside the state. And so oftentimes, one of the things that we've observed in the field is that the structures that the states create, rules and rewards and contracts and permissions and things like that for civil society activities, often it might be too simplistic to say they seek to place the two in opposition to one another or play them against one another, but that's the effect that it often ends up having, particularly within the last couple of years, really the last 5 and 6 years, as so much of the civil society funding for Central Asia has shifted to countering violent extremism related projects. It's created both competition between Islamic civil society organizations and secular civil society organizations, and also created incentive structures, many of them I think are unintentional, that cause or lead civil society organizations that are, what we might call secular in sort of the Western liberal tradition, to see themselves really in opposition to Islamic civil society organizations and perceive them as a threat, a threat that they are supposed to be countering. And I think this is in many ways counterproductive for meeting the needs of communities that the donor organizations are trying to meet. Many times it is the Islamically associated organizations or self-defined Islamic organizations that have much more access to communities that the donors want to reach. And they also tend to have long histories, often of trust within those communities. And so I see, and talked about it in my part of the workshop, a need to move beyond these divisions and a need, particularly from the donor perspective, to ensure that we're working to harmonize groups so that we can best reach our intended recipients for donor projects, rather than creating more division or reinforcing securitization.
I might just add, I mean, I think Noah's right, but I think we, in our academic effort to sort of create a sense of nuance in how we're looking at these things, we have to keep in mind that a lot of donor organizations and others characterizing it in a particular way has implications for how it might get understood and engaged with, right? So there can be some unintended consequences by trying to disaggregate as whether it's secular or Islamic, when the driving forces should, I mean, I would argue for the driving force being how do you improve people's lives in a substantive way.
It's true, and I agree with what both of you said. Now, the question right now is taking the opportunity that what you mentioned, Noah, about the donor communities. How do you work with Islamic Civil Society as a donor organization when certain projects that are deemed sensitive from state authorities in Central Asia have to be approved by the governments in the region? It's problematic, and to be honest, the issue here is like how authorities perceive actually Islamic civil society in the region. How do you think they perceive these organizations?
Continue this discussion. I think also before we start discussing what is Islamic and what organization is it registered or not, and what kind of relations between the state and these organizations. I think you said you already started this discussion on part 1 and saying what kind of organizations are there. But I think it still should be really clear, are we talking about these state-registered organizations? Then we are talking about very limited kind of field, very limited kind of perceptions, and very limited kind of narratives, and very limited kind of interactions if we are talking about the state and these organizations, or donor and these kind of organizations. And we also, I think, should also differentiate between different fields where these activities or practices can be observed in form of a registered organization or in form of self-organized kind of practices which are not necessarily always registered. So is this a field of education? Is it a field of finances? Is it a field of tax production? Or is it a field of charity? Or is it a field of politics? Just to take an example from Uzbekistan, with coming of the Mirziyoyev, who kind of, he didn't desecuritize what we observe in most of the countries, what is happening in the field of Islamic organizations or Islamic movements or Islamic practices. He didn't desecuritize the whole thing, but he is at least kind of opening up more to this kind of field, whatever you want. Of course, he is trying to stay on the level of registered organizations, let's say Islamic universities or registered mosques or whatever registered organizations. And they are doing all kinds of now new projects where they have media and media projects together with Islamic organizations, where they organize this kind of platforms for educating the youth and etc. And this is one kind of engagement what we see, for example, in Uzbekistan. Whereas in Turkmenistan, you have only the closure, or in Tajikistan as well. But then you have other kind of developments which were already voiced by Noah, like when they go underground, when they're securitized and secretive, and other kinds of discourses are kind of getting mixed.
Just to add on what you said, Rano, indeed, there are the ones who are registered and the ones who are like, I don't know if I can call them secretive or independent, but what I gathered from the first part of the podcast recording was that several Islamic civil society organizations try to keep a low profile so as not to have any issues with authorities. So they try not to attract too much attention, public attention, not to be so visible, while at the same time being active and helping at the community level, very local community level.
It is important to understand that within this framework, operating within these very authoritarian states, one of the purposes of ensuring that that donor funding and donor projects goes only to pre-approved registered organizations and things like this is to ensure that they can keep control over what's happening and ensure that really in many ways to discourage self-forming civil society and citizen activism and all of these things like that, where for many people living within these states, and I think this is true equally of all of them, particularly as you go further away from the capital, you have a state that has these very strong ambitions to be the Soviet Union again, to have that level again, both of control, but also with the control that comes with that, to be able to squeeze out the rest of civil society that would deliver public goods and deliver public services that the state is not able to deliver. But none of the states up to this point, and how could we expect them to 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have reached a level where they can deliver those public goods and services. And so by squeezing civil society and then also not having the budget to deliver many of the basic public goods and services, including quality education for many of their citizens, you end up in a situation where lots of people are living with really extreme levels of inequality, where those within the capital can get access to good education and roads and clean water and heat and things like that, whereas in other areas not far outside the capital, if you drive, not to pick on Uzbekistan, but we did some field work with focus groups there recently and found that 2.5 hours outside the capital, the most common problem that people raised was not having heat in the winter and not having electricity. And when the government has limited resources to be able to deliver all of these things, much less education, I think it is, if our interest in the donor community and from the Western perspective, not from the Western perspective, from the donor community perspective, from all over the world, if our interest is to improve the access of populations to those goods and services, as David was saying, then I think it really is incumbent on us to encourage these authoritarian states to widen the field of civic activism. And one of the ways that we can do that is to go beyond, particularly as donor organizations, recognizing just those organizations that we would consider normative civil society from our own background. We should accept locally improvised and locally appropriate decisions, and not just things that look like civil society in Brussels or in Washington or in Boston or something like that. And I think Islamic civil society has a potentially a huge role to play there.
I mean, I agree. I think that I think it's important. In some ways, I think we're conflating a couple things. Like one, we're talking about sort of a research agenda about the questions of Islamic civil society and civil society more broadly. And then we're asking about a more applied type of policy question. And I think that we should keep those somehow separate, because I think in many instances, there's a lot more space for different types of civil society organizations to locally work together than we give credit for, right? I mean, I think that many of them are quite pragmatic. They're trying to address local problems. I think that there are both, we focus a lot on formal organizations and informal organizations and characterize the informal organizations as perhaps being a threat to the state, when it just could be that, they're not, I mean, they're just informal. They're not formally registered or set up, and really more focused on addressing people's needs that are quite basic. And so I think that you could have a myriad of formal civil society organizations, Islamic and secular, who work with formally and informally with some of the informal organizations as well. I think it's we just need to be a bit more, I think, creative in how we think about addressing the problems.
Thank you very much, all of you, for raising this point. We'll get back to that in a bit. Now, it seems that Islamic civil society organizations or NGOs on the ground who actually tackled and dealt with, issues that people are facing, such as like access to heat or electricity, basic needs. So when these organizations are able to take up the mantle and work and support these groups, these vulnerable communities, it seems that it raises their popularity and their visibility among local population. Is this why Islamic civil society, especially during periods of crisis such as COVID-19, have gained so much popularity in the region? Is it something else? Is it maybe distrust towards the authorities or other local community services and so on? This is again a question for all of you. Whoever wants to go first, go ahead, Rana.
I can start. I think you are right. I think both that in those situations where states don't deliver, these gaps should be somehow filled. And the same goes for the situations of crisis, or in the situations where science doesn't offer solutions, like in the COVID situation. Then people somehow lack this kind of finding solutions, where then spiritual agency offers a quick hand for filling this kind of gaps, where then of course the gaining of legitimacy of this kind of organizations or not organizations or initiatives gain somehow more power and legitimacy and authority and gain also popularity, of course. And what we also see in Central Asia. And as you see that, we saw all that in the times of COVID, for example, all these migrants were just left by all these governments. They were even not allowed to enter their own countries, where, for example, when thousands of migrants were left without jobs, They had to leave Moscow because they couldn't pay their bills. The home didn't accept them because they didn't dare to open their borders, and the people were just left without anything and without anybody. Yeah. So I think we have to really consider this kind of gaps which are filled by this kind of organizations or initiatives.
I agree. I mean, I think we have to be cognizant of the bureaucratic struggles that people face in trying to meet their human needs. And, these do have implications for, someone's confidence in the functionality of a government. And if the government seems not to be providing what is needed locally and someone else does, it seems to make sense that you can rely a bit more on who's providing the needs rather than the one who isn't.
It's probably good to emphasize also that we shouldn't assume that Islamic civil society organizations or Islamic society actors define themselves, somehow as in competition with the state or with state authorities. They may be fulfilling needs that people wish that the state would fulfill, since, at least in my own experience, I found lots of people in the Central Asia like sort of a lot of things about the Soviet social model, and like the idea of having a strong state, that will deliver social welfare. But on the other hand, there are lots of Islamic civil society actors who also are a part of business community, because that gives them other space within which to operate. But I think probably what I wanted to emphasize in my own presentation in the workshop and in this is that there is not a necessary competition or conflict between these. And I think both from a research and from a policy perspective, we see evidence that there isn't a necessary conflict between these things. A project that we recently did in Kyrgyzstan among ethnic minority communities found one of the findings was that national minorities in particular felt that the relative religious freedom that they were able to enjoy in Kyrgyzstan compared to states where their co-ethnics are originally from. So, for example, if you take the Uyghur community in Bishkek now, they are able to enjoy a great deal more personal and religious freedom than their co-ethnics in Xinjiang, and this is something that they're very cognizant of. I mean, they do feel that is under threat, but at the same time, now they see that as one of the most positive aspects of citizenship. And so I think some state actors in particular sometimes make an assumption that citizens will see these two identities in tension with one another, being a secular citizen of a secular state and a member of a religious organization or a member of a minority, all of these things. But I think we see in reality for many people that they don't necessarily see those things in tension. As long as the state allows them freedom to practice their religion, allows them freedom of conscience that's promised really in all of the constitutions, then they don't see a conflict between these two things. It doesn't necessarily have to arise.
If we see what happened in 2005 in Andijan, where the business entrepreneurs who were doing 5% of their income for establishing this kind of charity foundations, which were then seen as somehow threatening by the state, because this funding was provided to cover for charity reasons like basic needs, which actually Uzbek state should have just covered. And the interests collapsed, and we all saw what happens at the end of this collapse. So I think in some kind of constellations, it can become competitive or can lead to some kinds of conflicts, which could then really go uncontrollable, I think. So I think it's very diverse, I would say.
I would like to go back to the point that Noah raised earlier in terms of convincing like donor community, the research community, the authorities, regimes in Central Asia, in widening a little bit the scope of what kind of civil society organizations should be included in working with local communities and involving Islamic civil society as well. Now, there was a point that was raised by you, David, during the workshop, where you mentioned that facilitating dialogue sometimes is not good enough. And I wanted to ask you in which format one should engage with Islamic civil society and how we can bring on the same table secular or Western style civil society organization, donors, Islamic civil society, and the authorities, the governments in the region.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in some respects, it gets at what I was trying to talk about earlier about the disaggregation between whether we're talking about a research project or how groups of people work together. Part of my initial questioning about the use of Islamic civil society as a category really is that you don't necessarily see that having to be used in other parts of the world, other parts of the Muslim world, right? In some ways we fetishize it because of, my sense is because of the Soviet experience, that now we're at a point where people need to sort of state claims to what they're doing as being religiously motivated, rather than just accepting that religious motivation can be part of anything that one does without having it to be characterized as such. So the question in terms of how do you get them to work together, I guess the thing that I struggle with is the idea that that would be difficult. I think that by characterizing one group as secular and one group as Islamic, we do put this dichotomy that somehow there would be a tension in working together. And I think if we have to resolve the ideological differences that may drive the behaviors of the group, that may be the case. But I don't think we have to begin with that. I think that we were talking about the confidence of who might be providing services for a population. And you can see where there are local groups that are trying to do this when the state is falling a bit short. That would seem to me a place where any type of civil society group could collaborate. They could collectively come together and say, what are some of the problems, challenges that people are facing in this community? They need not come to terms on, what ideologically drives them to want to engage and to address these problems, right? They need not to resolve where they are along a spectrum of religiosity or its absence. And so I would, that's what I was sort of trying to push a bit, is that I think that, confidence in what another group will do comes from doing things together. And I think we assume we have to resolve all of these ideological tensions before we actually engage them in practice. And I think it's perhaps the other way around. There are ways that we can do this without having to address interpretations of Islamic ideology or secular ideology.
It's a very fair point, David. Sorry, Ran, I will just give you immediately the floor, but I just wanted to also put an extra layer. I think it's also an issue of trust in terms of like working with each other and also involving governments. And I want to add also the level of working with governments. Maybe it would be beneficial, maybe not. You can challenge that if you want, if you like, to involve also GONGOs, state-controlled NGOs. There are risks, certainly, in working with Congos and at the same time with independent civil society or Islamic civil society organizations, but maybe this is a first step on working with each other. And I want your thoughts also on that. But first, Rano, go ahead, and maybe you can also answer that as well.
Yeah, thank you for this point. I will come back to it. Just wanted to add what David said. I really fully agree with that. I think to add, besides this ideological bias, I think we can also see where one could cooperate or collaborate within this very bright and diverse field. I think, for example, if we see we already voiced that the problem was securitized approaches, where one could collaborate to desecuritize the same field, where different kind of initiatives could be kind of addressed. So I think this kind of focusing on existing problems within the same field, I think, would be helpful. And going back to your question, yes, state and registered organizations, and falling then into this again, the registration bias, yes, I think that could be a first step, but I think we should really then also do the second step and consider this diversity in the same field. That there is not only registered organizations, there are other organizations, other initiatives, and there are other fields as well.
Because I think it's important to consider the relationships and the level at which they exist, because we're conflating those, that somehow the state is the same type of entity as an organization working in a community, a local community, right? I think they serve very different needs, and part of what I was trying to, and those needs go very far. I think that I was trying to draw attention to Tani's early work in sociology around the distinction between community and society. I think we can get a sense that those are two different types of endeavors that have a relational aspect to it. When we're talking about local NGOs, we're often talking about groups that are, whether they're Islamic or secular, we're talking about groups that are engaging in communities. Now, they may be engaged broadly at the level of society, but I think a lot of what we're sort of interested in, and I think in this respect, some of the Islamic groups do this a bit better, is relationships around community. And the distinction that I sort of tried to carry out a bit and is that I think that, you can sort of see, community as being associated with trust and belonging, right? That people feel a certain level of reliability and a thickness of relationships within communities that you don't always have within societies. Societies are often mitigated, more by confidence in the types of behaviors, but also in terms around rights, sort of more legalistic types of characterizations. And as I was trying to suggest, I think that, the level of engagement at the community that's driven by some of the underlying moral forces that get brought into sort of Islamic characterizations of the sort of the motive behind the civic engagement is a bit more conducive to creating communities of belonging and engagement in ways that the state doesn't. So I think we need to sort of also appreciate those types of differences in what we're looking at and what we're expecting the organizations to be able to do. I think that when we're talking about moving further out from the cities and into the villages and meeting the needs of people, we're really talking about how people can do it at a very basic, sort of community-centric level.
It feels like the discussion in the workshop and our discussion today has led us to a place where we may be suggesting that, maybe both from a policy and from an analytical approach, it may be better to broaden our worldview here, to broaden our spectrum, to consider really all sorts of informal civil society organizations and look at, sort of self-defined or self-organized Islamic or faith-based organizations as part of that whole spectrum of community-based organizations that, may define themselves one way or may define themselves as another way. They may self-organize around, all being pensioners from a certain factory or having all lived on a collective farm in the past, or having all been graduates of, one university or something. There are, just like in all communities, there are infinite ways that people can self-organize. And maybe what this is telling us is that there is a lot more to civil society in Central Asia, particularly in communities outside the capitals, than what we see in these sort of normative registered NGOs that are, for a lot of donors, still unfortunately really the only vehicles through which they can give grants. And one of the things that we might want to consider is how to help those organizations form coalitions and partnerships with Islamic actors, with actors from other ethnic groups, with actors from, other types of other communities, that cut across them. Because I think one of the other things that we notice in this thing that gets described as sort of an opposition between normative Western liberal civil society and Islamic civil society, I think underneath that, that sort of hides other divisions, subdivisions within society, as David is saying. We have ethnic difference there in some areas. We have a big difference between urban and rural in many areas. We have, language and dialect and all kinds of other differences so the picture may be more complex than what we can get at just with, dividing things between Islamic society and normative civil society.
Yes, David.
I mean, Rano made a really important point earlier that I want to come back to, because I think this matters, right? When she was talking about the businessmen in Andijan, right? And does it matter that they were religious? I mean, they were contributing part of their salaries, part of their income to supporting people locally. And I would argue that it could be seen as equally as threatening to the state, whether they were just doing that as a collective of individuals, or whether it's seen as being characterized as religious in motivation. I think that we make assumptions going all the way, that somehow people's motives as being religious are problematic, whereas I think even the act by some states could be seen as threatening.
So, thanks, David, for raising these questions, because I was going back to your discussion about how should we maybe distinguish between, according to Tony's, to Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, so civil society and communities, and what are the differences and legal normative approaches and Western vision of this kind of organizations. But let me throw a paradox here. I think if you see how much legitimacy and authority is on what level and on what kind of forms of engagement, I'm talking now about the Islamic values, are becoming more politically important, that these initiatives, which are not registered, which are underground, which, if you want to call it, which are happening in trust-based societies or communities, for me, these terms don't make sense. But let's say they happen behind the doors, but they are the ones who are gaining the weight. They are the ones who are legitimized in the eyes of these masses which are attending all these behind doors or underground type of organizations. And that's where also, let's say, politics of the religion is also playing behind the scenes, that we all know, but they are all not registered. So this paradox is that is politics is played only in these normative-based, legally recognized fields, or we see the politics actually really de facto playing in those behind doors, underground or unregistered, self-organized initiatives where they also gain more power, not only under the circumstances of not functioning states or crisis situations like COVID, but also already since long time, as they were working and they were systematic and they were addressing the problems. Yes, they didn't maybe openly challenge the states, as Noah said, they didn't, but between the words they did, yeah. And in Anjujan, maybe they did it more openly, yes. Does it matter to be that this is religious or not? In this case, it was mattering because the narrative was that according to Zakat, 5% of the income should be. So this kind of was formulated in religious terms, and this was kind of already becoming more political because it was kind of in process challenging the state services and state itself. So it was gaining the power in the eyes of this Uzbek state. It was gaining enough power to become a real opposition, which is then also supported by the people. So that's where then the conflicts arise, where the states then see it as a raising power and challenging their positions.
No, I mean, I don't disagree, Rano. I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to pull it out, it could have been perceived as equally threatening, even if you didn't justify it as the cut, right? That you can have an organization that, I mean, I think things locally, politics are often local, if not always local. So certainly, there is a lot of influence that happens within communities that could challenge the state, especially a state that seems unable to address local needs. I just wonder if sometimes we don't read into things because of how we characterize them as being Islamic or not, right? That at a very functional level, it could still be threatening to the state, even if you don't use the language of Islam. Certainly a lot of the Western development organizations don't use that language and also get characterized as being threatening to the state, right? So I think that's sort of what I was trying to push, is that sometimes our own bias and how we analyze or make assumptions about what it means to be a religious organization, a secular organization, and such get in the way of what happens.
I would like to wrap up this very interesting discussion by asking all three of you to share like concrete areas or steps where that you think various forms of civil society organizations can cooperate or form dialogue in Central Asia, and if this period, if I may call it like post-COVID-19 recovery period, can provide such venues for cooperation and dialogue among Islamic civil society organizations and other forms of civil society organizations in Central Asia. I would like to start with you, Noah, and we'll move to David, and then we'll finish with Rana.
I think certainly there are lots of these opportunities to take a specific program as an example. A few years ago, I would get this wrong if I tried to identify exactly what it was or the name of the project. But I know that the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, sponsored the development of some CSO centers in a number of communities in southern Kyrgyzstan. Really, they supported offices and office spaces and some funding for a coalition of civil society organizations of all kinds of different stripes who were active, within a community in order to foster cooperation and build networks and bridges across those things. I think it was a strong idea as a project and a good direction to move in. I think once it begins to operate, and once those organizations start to interact with one another, there is a separate question about whether the local government authorities, much less national government authorities, are comfortable with allowing them any independence in their activity and allowing them to cooperate across lines into things that are, less formally organized civil society and things like that. I think in terms of like religious organizations, in the limited observation that I had in one of those centers, they were quite happy to, work with, say, the imam of the mosque, registered with the Committee on Religious Affairs and this sort of thing, but don't have any reach into these other self-organized religious communities that are the core of socialization and community level support for a large portion of people living in the city, in that particular city. I won't say which one it was. So I think I think we can see areas where we can see a start and a promising start to these things. But a lot of this, how far we can go or how far those organizations can go, depends a lot on sort of what they can imagine in terms of recognizing the legitimacy of organizations, what states can imagine, and local governments even can imagine. We keep talking about Andijan, and I think I would defer to Renaud on this, but I think there's a lot of evidence that many of those decisions were made on a very local level, within the city. And so there are, we're not even talking about national level policies, but, political competition and things like that within city level governments. And so I think it also, a useful takeaway to that is that we can't just stop at the national level. And this might be one reason why it may be helpful, why engaging with Gongos who are primarily centered in capital cities again may not be the most productive way of getting at this, but even trying to set very locally based pilot programs that get down to the community level that David has reminded us of.
Being aware of the local power dynamics and the challenge that's before if the civil society organizations start being successful enough, and often they are more successful than perhaps the state in providing the services that are deemed as needed, whether or not that becomes perceived as threatening by the state, right? They're filling a need, and and it's often in awareness that the state isn't fulfilling that need. But once it's being fulfilled, does that create political challenges for the state itself? I think as I sort of talked earlier about the need to sort of disaggregate between the research question and the sort of practical question, the research question is trying to understand those types of dynamics. I think the practical question around cooperation and dialogue, I think that we, and I mentioned this during the workshop, I think that we focus too much on dialogue. We expect it to do more than it needs to do. That really, there's probably not a lot that they need to, work through ideologically. I think that the very fact that they can, if you can come together and identify some of the basic needs that the groups, the civil society organizations are working to try to address, there is space in which they can do these things. set out broad parameters, but simply coming together to discuss them through dialogue doesn't address the practical challenges that people face. And I think that all too often we make the assumptions that dialogue solves the problem. The more you know about the issues, the better you're going to be able to address them. To an extent that's true, but also to an extent that that kicks the can down the road, right? So I think that allowing a space for people to actually do things together is where the potential for collaboration and gaining something akin to trust in the other can develop.
I think we can learn a lot from Arabic donors who are really doing a lot. They were even called Zolotoy Dozhd after the engagement, since 90s, yeah? So if you look at what they do, like they just go to a very rural areas or whatever, they open an internat, which is an educational center like Ikhlas in, I think it was in Kazakhstan. They take 50 poor families, and the children of poor families who cannot send their children otherwise to schools, they just send them to these boarding schools where they then also not only learn the subjects that they should learn at school, but also then they can promote their values they want. So I think, yes, I would say that there is a real potential there to be engaging with this kind of initiatives. I think I could just name two keywords like gender and youth. And for example, during my field research, where I was attending bright schools, where they were learning Arabic and canons of Quran and Islam, they were very open. They wanted me to lecture on how the youth, there was only the youth groups there who were attending this kind of schools. And I was supposed to tell them how it is to be West, to go to university in the West. Is it good or not? Because everybody wants to do that. So you should tell them that it's not always good. So my, for example, role in this school was to deliver a lecture about my experiences in the West as a woman from Central Asia, and how I keep up with my Islamic identity or Muslim identity. So that was an interesting challenge for me, coming from a Western institution and still at the same time being an Uzbek woman there. So what I want to say here is that these kind of initiatives or organizations or this kind of groups are not necessarily closed. They are very much open to dialogue, and they are very much open to any kind of innovations that could be contributed within their formats. Like it was like Quran lesson first and my lecture second, and third, how to be a proper bride and solve conflicts at home. So it was very different things at the same time, but they were very open. So, and all these youth camps, for example, that are organized with Arabic money, where they have all these camps, female, both mixed. Also, this is also another, as I said, throwing the words youth and gender. I think there is a much potential and space to get into dialogue, engage, contribute, collaborate in different projects. They are not closed, in my experience. And I think if we just find some kind of common interest in all kinds of initiatives, it could be really, there is kind of a very big potential to collaborate and to engage together.
So with that, again, thank you very much to all three of you for your participation. I'm Andreas Marazis, and that was the ENC In Depth podcast.